And first is a professor here, Cornell Brooks. He is a professor in the practice of public leadership and social justice at the Kennedy School. He's also director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the school's Center for Public Leadership. He's also a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School. Professor Brooks is the former president of the NAACP. I bet you didn't know that. I did. We went to the same college. And he's a civil rights attorney and an ordained minister. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brooks. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so I gave you his introduction, but he's actually speaking second. And before that is Professor Edelman. Peter Edelman is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law and Public Policy and the Facility Director of the Center on Poverty and Inequality at Georgetown University Law Center. He is the author of Not a Crime to Be Poor, The Criminalization of Poverty in America, and So Rich, So Poor, Why It's So Hard to End Poverty in America. A top advisor to Senator Robert Kennedy from 1964 to 1968, he went on to fill various roles in President Clinton's administration, from which he famously resigned in protest after Clinton signed the 1996 welfare reform legislation. He lives in Washington, D.C. Professor Edelman, please join me in welcoming.
Into a live. Right. Great. Okay. Check it out. Start over again. Hello. I am so glad to be here, and I thank you. My good friend Kat Townsend is the particular cause of this, but I've been knowing for the years as this has gone on, bigger and bigger, and it's just so important, so wonderful. And it does, if we're all worried about the future, here you are, and all of the different important issues that are being discussed today. So I do have this book, which is the subject that we're talking about here, but I just want to start by saying that I've worked on these issues, the poverty issues, for many, many years, and indeed, her grandfather, I worked with Robert Kennedy, and it's really how I got started working on poverty issues. But this book covers materials that were largely new for me. And what opened my eyes, and I suspect for a lot of you, was the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And when the Department of Justice, many of you know, went in to investigate that, he found that that city there in St. Louis County was abusing its own citizens with unbelievable, exorbitant fines and fees for so-called quality of life crimes, and sending them to jail where they could not pay. Now, put aside that it's mean, to say the least, but also it's not very good thinking, because you have people who have very low incomes, and you're putting them in jail and they can't pay the fines, and it costs money to turn the lights on in the jail. But we'll put that to one side. And what we found, and again, you've been reading and knowing and so on, but the country began to understand, although not enough yet, that this abuse is widespread. So just a couple of illustrations. there's a man named Adel Edwards who lives in Pelham, Georgia. And he has a significant intellectual disability, and he can't read and write. And he was fined $500 for burning leaves without a permit in his backyard. And added to that was another $528 for so-called probation of a for-profit company. And when he couldn't come up with the first instant payment of $250, he was sent to jail, which, among other things, is unconstitutional. He is African American, and that's typical. Disproportionately, the people around the country who get caught in all of this are people of color. So that's one. Secondly, just and the reason I kind of add this to my note is it makes a little different point. I just helped write a brief about a man named George Ritchie in Missouri, and he's white. He lives in rural Missouri, and he's a SSI. He has a disability, and he gets $600 a month. And he was arrested on some thing that the initial fine was $125. Well, he couldn't pay that, and so he was, same story as with Edwards, he was thrown into jail. Then, after 90 days, he got out, except he owed them a little more than $3,000 for his room and board. Pay to stay, it's called, has a name. And it turns out that that's another thing that's all over the country. And in his case, and this is again typical, after the 30 days were over and he couldn't pay for that, then since he couldn't pay for that, they threw him back in for another $2,000 and some dollars at a point in time. And the stories, every time that I or someone or any of you knows about this, sometimes it may be a journalist, but a lawyer came into it. And of course, one of the important things about doing something, we want people who care about this, and that's the reason why we're talking about it today, but specifically, particularly one by one, but also litigation that is on the large of the subjects and going to legislature as well. So as we talk here, there's a pending appeal in the Missouri State Supreme Court to take down all of that in the state. People had it's just so much to do. It finally got around to somebody understanding not only that there was his case, but that this was all over rural Missouri. And even in the state head of the state and the local judges in St. Louis and the suburbs, they've all said, don't, this is bad stuff. Anyway, finally there's a lawsuit, and we'll see what happens. All right. Just to give you those two examples. Well, those two add up, pure and simple, to the criminalization of poverty. I mean, it's a systematic way for states and communities to raise millions of dollars. And we're talking about here the best estimates, 10 million people around the country. And adding up to $50 billion. That's what we think. And it is the two main things are people who were arrested, like the two that I gave you, and the even bigger things, I'll say a word about it, is taking away people's driver's licenses. That's how the money goes. Why do we have this? Well, we do have things that we pay. If you're older, you remember we didn't used to. If you were going to go into an art museum or go into a park or all of those kind of user fees. So to the others, the courts and others, said, oh, this is a user fee. That's what these things are. You didn't know that. They're user fees. And so they were looking around when the anti-tax rebellion started in the 1980s, really, the Reagan period. They looked any state, local government looking for money. This is one of the things that they hit on, and so that's where this started. And so doing this, it hits people all over the country, and particularly when you're talking about the instances where a person gets thrown in jail, it's really the 21st century debtors' prisons, and then some. And another sort of picture of it, you go into municipal courtrooms in many places. I saw it myself in New Orleans, in Cleveland, it's true in St. Louis, I know about Montgomery, Alabama, and this is what you would see. Men and some women, all of them, depending on the top part of the country, but all or nearly African American men and Latino and other parts of the country in orange jumpsuits. And they're there because of what I'm talking about. So how does it work? Well, I'll give you the two stories. I mean, one is that at the time that they haul you in and you can't pay, you get put into a bogus probation, which isn't a probation at all, it's just about money. And you're charged $50 a month or $40 a month. You get nothing for that. You're just paying. Interesting point on that. All of it's interesting. That's a word for it. 13 states. It's for profit. 44 states charge people for their probation. That's 31 probation agencies that are just like we used to know them, except they're not. And I was in Minnesota yesterday talking. Minnesota, nice. Charge money in parts of, not every place, but in parts of the state. They charge to be on probation. So it's bogus, and you have this kind of for profit all over the place, not just in prison and the pay for stay that I told you about, but and probation, but diversion. And so if they offer the diversion and you can't pay for it, then you don't get the diversion. You go through the system instead. If you have bail, or you'd be lucky enough to get out for bail, but you have to have the electronic ankle bracelets, you're back in there because it's all tied. And the fees are Oklahoma 28 different types of fees added to the fines, and so that. You got to understand, it's fines and fees, and they're two different things. 20 in Florida, and it's everything you can think of. Pay for the courthouse library. There you go. Or maybe there's a gym in the courthouse. And so you can't pay on the payment plans. The interest mounts up, and it just goes up and up and up. Another version, which is very important, is money bail. And because one of the ways that you get hooked is you are being held, you can't pay the money. Might not be very much, but you don't have very much money. The only way you get out of there, if your family can't pay, is you go and plead guilty when you're not guilty of anything. And then you get the payment plan and everything that I said. So that's how it all works. And on the money bail, it's a bigger problem. Separately, it's a tool, as I just said. But we have in jails, not prisons, but jails, 700,000 people in any given day are in jails in this country. And there are, of those on any given day, 450,000 of the 700,000 are guilty of nothing because they're waiting there. They've been bail has been set and they can't pay. Story that I already told you. 450,000 who shouldn't be there at all. Let's say that there's some that are dangerous, but a very, very small number of those. I mentioned the driver's license suspensions. That's a really big thing. At least somewhere between 40 and 45 states use that. You have to. It works really well. You have to drive to get to work. Get your kids to school. Another arrest. Another crime. Owing more money. And they may use jail. They may use taking it out of your check from working, or your refund from the state taxes. So, and none of this is about anybody who did anything that's dangerous. Okay, we're going to take it away from somebody who's out there drinking and driving. This is people largely to get who haven't paid court debt. And it isn't even related to automobiles at all. In Montana, they'll take it away if you don't pay your tuition loan. Just one example. And the numbers are, they were 4 million people. It's gone down some because some good work in the state has brought it down somewhat. They've taken away the court debt as the basis for taking it away. $4 million in California, 1 out of 6 of adults in the state. Texas, 1.8 million, 1.2 million in North Carolina, 1 million in Florida, almost 1 million in Virginia. It's really big money. Like I said, $10 billion, 50 million people. The juvenile as well. Pay for probation, supervision, diversion, all those same things. Drug testing for somebody who has no drug problem, paying the room and board, and you think about it for a kid doing that. I was the commissioner of juvenile justice in New York in the 70s. It's something that you can't even think about as making any sense. And anyway, it's especially in my mind. And what happens is very often the family can't pay, and so the child, now an adult, carries that into adulthood, and it ruins their credit. They have collateral consequences, like anybody who's been. So they're going to have trouble getting a job. They're going to have trouble getting anything like public housing, a whole bunch of things. It's just absolutely horrible. And just parenthetically, because I don't have another place to put it right now, and with this, the collateral consequences across the board in age, there are 45,000 laws in the country of one form of collateral consequences. 45,000. So they're all separate, a barber can't do it, and somebody else can, so it adds up to 45,000. And the other thing is, if you're like a young woman that I talked to who went through this mess in California, you don't, and she got through diversion, but she was still going to have the arrest. You also has to have the whole thing expunged. And this is a major thing for people to be working on, to work on expungement. So this is what we have. I mean, there are things, I don't have it. Maybe what we can do it is we can go along, and you're going to talk about it too. There are people who are working on these things, and it's so important that you know that. So I'll come back on it. Let me just say, and maybe I've got a minute or two, but this is really modern peonage. And it really is a government-operated loan shark system. So that's what we've done. Just think about it. It's like the sharecropping in the old days. You get stuck, you know, the way you weren't able to pay everything, and you had to pay the owner of the. You're stuck for the next year and the next year after that. Maybe we'll have time to get into the fact that we're sending kids not to the principal's office anymore. We're sending them to court, things like that. This book goes through a whole bunch of things, forcing the police to, not forcing the police, but when a woman goes to the police and calls too much, all over the country, and if it's more than 2 or 3 times, the police say to the landlord that she has to be evicted, including a place in Missouri, which is thankfully been gotten rid of, but there said not only could you say to her that the landlord had to kick her out, but in Maplewood, Missouri, they said they can kick you out of town, be banned from the town for 6 months. I kid you not. And that again, lawyer found out about it, and they took it on, and they settled it, and they got the ordinance taken out. So you have a whole bunch of other things if you just think about it, and I can share as we go through what happens to homeless people, for example. The whole question of mental health, but instead of a system that we ought to have, they're in jail and prison, and that's certainly about criminalization of poverty. So we'll talk about the bail reform that's going on in a lot of places, and the work on the driver's license that's going on, and work on the fines and fees, and so we'll have a chance to come back at that. But I do want to say that we need the people. That we're doing pretty well with the lawyers. We're seeing more wins in court. We're seeing more legislation, more reform among the judges. But you think about mass incarceration, that's really a movement now. And what we need for all of this is a movement. And so it's terrifically important for everybody. It's especially important to have students to get involved in this. There certainly are ways to find people within the state to get involved. So let me just say what I always say in these things to end with, which is that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, great friend of Dr. King, and if we read his books here, we wouldn't get out until next week. But he did say this, which I think about every day, and that is, we're not all guilty, but we're all responsible.
Okay, so with that, I've already introduced the distinguished Professor Brooks, and without further ado.
Well, first of all, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be on a panel with Peter Edelman. I'm old enough to remember when he resigned from the Obama administration and really took a... I said Obama, excuse me. Clinton administration in protest in terms of welfare reform. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. It is my deep belief that hope cannot be empirically demonstrated, it must be morally chosen. But that being said, there are moments in our lives as advocates where we have to make the case for hope. And so when we look at the criminalization of poverty over the course of decades, when we consider the erection of this architecture of exclusion that we call mass incarceration, we have to make the case for hope. I believe the case can in fact be made when we look at community-based efforts all across the country and this nascent movement. 10 years ago, prior to my tenure as president and CEO of the NAACP, I arrived in Newark, New Jersey as a bread and butter civil rights attorney with not a great deal of experience with criminal justice reform or the criminal justice system, never having spent any time in a juvenile lockup or in a prison. But it was my responsibility as the new CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice to take charge and responsibility for a prisoner reentry workforce development program. That is to say, it was our responsibility to serve literally hundreds of people coming out of prison, seeking baby clothes for their children, workforce development skills for themselves, interview clothes, a couch or a bed to sleep on, effort to either get gang tattoos removed or buy high-collar shirts that they might be covered. And so walking into this situation, not being particularly well-versed in the subject matter, having no experience in workforce development, I came head-to-head with some of my assumptions. It was my assumption that the problem that we were dealing with was the further impoverishment of people deemed to be criminals, when in fact, we were not dealing with the collateral damage of mass incarceration. We were not dealing with the economic effects of mass incarceration. What we were in fact dealing with was literally the criminalization of poverty. Why? Because most of the people going into prison were poor going in and further impoverished coming out. And I came to appreciate, just as Professor Edelman lifted up, the nexus between collateral sanctions, those punishments that are imposed on you post-conviction that can last for your lifetime. That is to say, a life sentence of unemployment, or a life ban in terms of public benefits, or a life ban in terms of having access to higher education. And so I began to appreciate the relationship between collateral sanctions, between the economic impact of a criminal record, and fines and fees, and the suspension of driver's licenses. And so you know the backdrop. You understand, of course, that we had 2.2 million Americans behind bars, 40 million Americans with criminal records. We 2.6 million people under the jurisdiction of our criminal justice system. More African American men under the jurisdiction of departments of correction in 2019 than was the case in terms of African Americans under the jurisdiction of Jim Crow slavery or slavery. And so here we are at this moment, and a case can be made for pessimism, a case can be made for cynicism. But here's what I want to share with you. So this small organization called the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, with 30 or 40 community-based organizations in Newark, New Jersey, not a particularly affluent city, but a city in which there is a strong sense of moral agency among the community-based organizations, among the citizens. So in the course of roughly 4.5 years, we passed a ban-the-box law. We passed bail reform. We passed prison reentry legislation that the New York Times called a model for the country. There was no money from any of the largest foundations. We didn't receive a check from the Koch brothers. There was not a great deal of guidance or direction, but in fact, people organized themselves. So let's talk about what community-based organizations were able to do and some of the lessons that we learned. So in terms of this matter of these municipal fines and driver's license suspensions, so what we mean by that is where we have people who pick up parking tickets in congested cities. You don't pay the parking tickets, you have fines that are levied, the fines of the parking tickets go up, bench warrants can be issued for your arrest. And let me just share with you, and I ask that you not share this beyond this room, but yours truly went to visit Nicholas Katzenbach, former Attorney General of the United States, in Princeton, New Jersey. I parked my car where I shouldn't have parked my car.